The wine glass shattered first. Then Seo Min-jae, the most feared, most respected chairman in South Korea, collapsed beside the table, the golden chandelier above him still glowing on what, seconds earlier, had been the happiest dinner of his life. Naomi dropped to her knees. Min-jae, wake up. The doors opened. Men in dark suits stepped in without a knock, unhurried, like people who already knew how the night would end. One knelt beside him, pressed two fingers to his throat, and waited. Then he looked up at Naomi. He's dead. No, she whispered. You said you promised he'd only sleep. I lied. Naomi threw herself over his body as they pulled her back, screaming his name, clawing, begging in a voice that no longer sounded like her own. They dragged her across the marble floor, and the last thing she saw before the doors closed was his hand, open and still, on the tile. She believed in that moment that she had just killed the only man she had ever loved. But 6 years earlier, he was simply the quiet Korean student she used to call Mr. Robot. And to understand how it came to this, we have to go all the way back to where it began. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Seo Min-jae was 36 years old the night that glass shattered, but this story doesn't start there. It starts nearly a decade earlier, on a university campus in America, where nobody knew his real name carried more weight than his father's fortune, and certainly nobody knew that fortune was built on an empire hidden beneath the surface of legitimate business. To his classmates, he was simply the brilliant, wealthy, painfully quiet Korean student who sat in the back row of every lecture, finished every exam early, and never once laughed at anything anyone said. Naomi Reed noticed him during their very first group project, mostly because he was the only person in the room who hadn't tried to impress anyone. While the rest of the group debated who would present, Min-jae had already finished formatting the slides, corrected 2 of their statistics, and said nothing about it. You know what your problem is? She'd said, sliding into the seat beside him with the kind of confidence that made people either love her instantly or find her slightly exhausting. He didn't look up from his laptop. I have several. Which one concerns you? You never smile. I smile when something is funny. Nothing in this room has been funny? Not yet. She'd laughed a real surprised laugh, and something about the sound made him glance up at her for just a second longer than necessary. That's it, she said, pointing at him like she'd just solved a case. I'm calling you Mr. Robot. That's inaccurate. Robots don't attend business school. Neither do people who never smile, apparently, so we're even. From that day forward, she called him nothing else. Mr. Robot in the library. Mr. Robot in the coffee line. Mr. Robot scrawled at the top of shared documents where his actual name should have been. He complained about it exactly once, and she ignored him exactly every time. One day, she told him over cheap dining hall coffee, I'm going to make you laugh, a real one, before we graduate. Impossible, he said in the same flat tone he used for everything. Challenge accepted. Over the next 4 years, their friendship grew the way real friendships do, not through big dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of small, ordinary hours. Late nights in the library when neither of them could sleep. Campus festivals where she dragged him to every terrible carnival game, and he secretly kept the stuffed animal she won for him. Study sessions that turned into 2-hour conversations about nothing and everything. She talked. He listened. She filled silences he didn't know he needed filled. One evening, sitting on the library steps with the sky turning orange above them, Naomi asked him a question she'd never asked before. What scares you, Min-jae? Like, actually scares you? He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Loving someone, he finally said. She laughed, assuming the way people often assumed with him that it was some dry, robotic joke. He didn't laugh with her. He simply looked back down at his notes, and something in the set of his jaw made the moment linger a beat too long to be a joke. Naomi wouldn't understand what that look meant for years. He hadn't been joking at all. Neither of them ever said what they were both beginning to feel. And then, the way these things so often happen, life made the decision for them. Min-jae's father died suddenly, and within a week, Min-jae had withdrawn from his final semester and flown home to Korea, leaving behind nothing but a hurried goodbye and a promise to stay in touch that neither of them fully believed. Naomi built her career in journalism. Min-jae inherited something he never wanted to talk about. 6 years passed, and an ocean of silence grew between two people who had once known each other better than anyone else alive. Now, in the present, Seo Min-jae stood at the head of a boardroom table 30 floors above Seoul, chairman of an empire that touched shipping lanes, luxury hotels, international finance, and private security firms across 3 continents. On paper, it was one of the most respected corporate conglomerates in Asia. Beneath the paper, it was something else entirely, an underground network his family had built over 2 generations, one that answered to no government and feared very few men. Unlike most men in his position, Min-jae rarely raised his voice and almost never raised a weapon. His power came from something colder and more permanent: strategy, patience, and a discipline that made even seasoned politicians choose their words carefully in his presence. He followed a code his father had built the empire on: control through respect, not terror. His one blind spot, the one place his discipline never quite reached, was the topic of love. He had built walls around that particular room in himself so early and so thoroughly that even he had started to believe there was nothing behind them. The only person who came close to seeing behind those walls was Park Hyun-soo, his head of security, a former Special Forces operative who had protected Min-jae for nearly 15 years and had never once given him a reason to doubt his loyalty. "You've been quiet again this week, Chairman," Hyun-soo said one evening, watching Min-jae stare out at the city lights without really seeing them. "I'm always quiet." "Not like this." Min-jae didn't answer. Some silences, even his oldest friend knew better than to push. Meanwhile, across the world, Naomi Reed had become exactly the woman anyone who knew her in college would have predicted: an award-winning investigative journalist, known for stories that made powerful people uncomfortable. When an international journalism conference invited her to speak in Seoul, she said yes almost before she finished reading the email, mostly because her widowed mother had always wanted to see Korea, and this felt like the perfect excuse to bring her along. Neither of them expected the trip to reopen anything. After the opening ceremony of the conference, Naomi stepped outside for air, scrolling through notes on her phone, not paying attention to the man walking toward the same elevator bank. They collided, almost literally, her shoulder against his arm, papers nearly scattering, and when she looked up to apologize, the words caught somewhere in her throat. "Min-ya?" For a long second, neither of them moved. Then, for the first time in years, something shifted across his face, small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. He smiled. Naomi's mouth fell open in mock disbelief. "Wait, did Mr. Robot just upgrade his software?" "It's been 6 years," he said. "Even robots receive updates eventually." She laughed, the same real, surprised laugh from all those years ago, and just like that, the 6 years of silence between them didn't disappear, but it stopped mattering quite as much. They didn't plan to see each other again. It simply happened, evening after evening, the way old friendships pick back up exactly where they left off, as though no time passed at all. Street food carts along crowded alleys. Long walks beside the Han River while the city lights reflected on the water. Convenience store snacks eaten on a bench at midnight because neither of them wanted the night to end yet. He remembered, without being told, that she liked her coffee too sweet. She remembered, without being told, which ramen stall he used to talk about back in college. She met his world in small, careful doses: a driver who called her Miss Reed with unsettling formality, an office building with security measures far beyond what any legitimate hotel conglomerate should have needed, a way people lowered their voices slightly whenever Min-jae walked past. She noticed these things the way a good journalist notices things, filing them away without asking, telling herself it wasn't her business to ask, that whatever he wasn't saying about his family's company was probably just old money being careful about old money. He, in turn, noticed the way she made friends with his staff within a single afternoon, charming the notoriously humorless head of his legal team into an actual laugh, learning his driver's daughter's name and asking about her the next time she saw him. She had a way of making cold, guarded people feel, briefly, like themselves again. He recognized it because she'd done exactly that to him, years ago, in a university library, and had apparently never stopped. Hyun-soo noticed the change before Min-jae did. "Chairman," he said one afternoon, trying and failing to keep a straight face, "you've smiled 3 times this week." "Have I? I was starting to think you'd forgotten how." Min-jae said nothing, but for once, he didn't correct him either. Their relationship deepened slowly, the way something real usually does, not through grand declarations, but through the accumulation of small honesty. Naomi never stopped calling him Mr. Robot, and every time she did, it landed a little softer, a little warmer, until it stopped sounding like a joke about his coldness and started sounding like something closer to a term of endearment. His staff began to notice it too, the chairman, feared across 3 industries, quietly amused by a nickname no one else would have dared use in his presence. One evening, a junior assistant made the mistake of trying the nickname herself, hoping to seem clever in front of the boardroom. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that Hyun-soo later joked he'd seen men survive gunfights with more composure than that assistant showed walking out. Only Naomi had ever earned the right to say it, and everyone in Min-jae's orbit understood, without being told, that the rule wasn't really about the nickname at all. There were other small collisions between her world and his moments that revealed, gently, just how far apart their lives had grown. She teased him mercilessly the first time his driver opened the car door for her, insisting she was perfectly capable of operating a door handle. He, in turn, was quietly baffled by her insistence on eating street food, standing up in the rain rather than sitting in any one of the dozen restaurants he could have called ahead to reserve. "You do understand," he said one night, watching her devour a paper cone of tteokbokki with far too much enthusiasm for the amount of chili sauce involved, "that I own several restaurants in this district. And none of them," she said through a mouthful, "taste like this." He didn't argue. He simply handed her a napkin, and when she wiped her mouth and missed a spot near the corner, he reached over without thinking and brushed it away himself. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them forgot it either. Their conversations grew longer, later, more honest. She told him, for the first time, about the father who'd left before she could remember his face, and the mother who had raised her alone on a journalist's stubbornness and not much else. He told her, carefully, in pieces, about a father whose approval he'd spent his whole life chasing and never quite caught before it was too late. Neither story fixed anything, but telling them to someone who actually listened made both of them feel a little less alone in carrying them. One rainy evening, huddled together under the narrow awning of a closed noodle shop, Naomi finally succeeded at something she'd been trying to do since college. She made him laugh, not the small, controlled exhale he usually allowed himself, but a real, full, surprised laugh that seemed to catch even him off guard. She pointed at him triumphantly. "There it is, mission accomplished." "Which mission?" "Making Mr. Robot laugh. I told you I'd do it before we graduated. I'm only 6 years late." "Better late than never," he said, and something in his voice made the joke feel like it meant more than either of them wanted to admit out loud. Later that night, walking her back through the wet, quiet streets, he said something he'd never said to anyone. "Do you know why I never smiled back then?" She laughed softly. "Because you're a robot. We've established this." He shook his head. "Because smiling made me forget, even for a second, the life that was waiting for me back home. I couldn't afford to forget. Not even for a second." He paused, looking at her in a way that made her breath catch. "Until I met you." Neither of them said the words that were sitting in the space between them. Neither of them needed to. But somewhere else in the city, a much older story was quietly closing in around them both, one neither of them knew existed yet, and one that had already chosen its target. Chairman Kang Tae-hyun had spent 20 years waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Decades earlier, he and Min-jae's father had built the foundation of the same organization together, before their partnership collapsed over a single, irreconcilable disagreement. Min-jae's father wanted to slowly transform the empire into something legitimate. Kang believed fear was the only currency that ever truly lasted. When the split came, Min-jae's father won, and Kang lost nearly everything he'd built. He never forgave it. He simply waited. For years, Kang had watched Min-jae from a careful distance, studying the empire his old partner's son had inherited, searching for the one weakness that could bring it all down. "Should we move against him now, sir?" his advisor asked one evening, laying photographs across the desk, surveillance images of Min-jae and Naomi walking along the river, laughing, unaware they were being watched at all. Kang studied the photographs for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "No," he finally said. He picked up one photo in particular, Naomi's face. Mid-laugh, sunlight catching in her eyes, and held it a moment longer than necessary. "His power was never his weakness," he said quietly. "This is..." He set the photograph down and looked up at his advisor, with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided how the story would end. "We don't attack the chairman," he said. "We attack his heart." 3 days later, Naomi's mother disappeared from her hotel room without a trace. Naomi's phone buzzed with a video call from an unknown number. When she answered, her stomach dropped through the floor. Her mother, tied to a chair in a room she didn't recognize, terrified, alive but clearly not safe. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. "Your mother is unharmed," Kang said. "For now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on you. What do you want?" "A small favor, nothing more." He explained it the way a man explains something he's already rehearsed 100 times, simple, reasonable, almost kind. A vial, a dinner, a drink shared between old friends. He called it a sedative, nothing more. Just enough to move Min-jae quietly without a scene, without violence, without anyone getting hurt. Her mother would be released the moment it was done. Naomi refused. She refused again the next day, and the day after that. She considered going to the police and stopped herself the instant she remembered the photograph her mother's face, hollow with fear, in a room Naomi couldn't identify. She considered hiring private investigators, the way she would for any other story, before remembering that this wasn't a story. It was her mother's life, weighed against a man she had spent 6 years, on and off, quietly falling in love with. She researched Kang's organization the only way she knew how carefully, methodically, the instincts of a journalist working even through her panic. What she found only tightened the trap further. Men who crossed Kang did not simply disappear. They vanished so thoroughly that even their names stopped being spoken. There was no clever headline that would save her mother. There was no investigation fast enough. There was only the vial sitting at the bottom of her bag, and the countdown Kang had given her, ticking quietly toward its end. Each time she considered warning Min-jae, each time she reached for her phone with his name already on the screen, a new message arrived first. A new photograph. A new proof that somewhere, her mother was still watching, still waiting, still in danger because of a choice Naomi hadn't even made yet. She was trapped in a corner with no door, and everyone she loved was standing on the other side of the walls, closing in around her. Eventually, with shaking hands and a heart she no longer recognized, she broke. She invited Min-jae to dinner. He said yes before she even finished the sentence. "I'll come with you tonight, Chairman," Hyun-soo offered, sensing something in Min-jae's mood he couldn't quite name. Min-jae smiled, the easy, unguarded smile that had become almost normal for him lately. "Not tonight. Tonight isn't business. I'm having dinner with an old friend." Hyun-soo let him go. But something about the last few weeks had left a quiet unease sitting in his chest, and instead of returning to headquarters, he followed at a careful distance, telling himself it was nothing, hoping he was wrong. That dinner became, without question, the happiest evening of both their lives. They talked about university, about the terrible carnival games, about the ridiculous nickname that had somehow followed them across 6 years and half the world. They dreamed out loud about futures neither of them had dared say to anyone else, about slowing down, about building something real, about what it might look like if this, whatever this was between them, was allowed to become something permanent. At one point, Naomi laughed so hard at one of his rare dry jokes that she nearly knocked over her water glass, and Min-jae reached out instinctively to steady it, his hand briefly covering hers. "You did it again, you know," he said quietly. "Did what?" "Made Mr. Robot laugh, twice in one night. I think that's a record." "I told you I'd fix you eventually," she said, smiling, though something behind her eyes didn't quite match the smile. "Took longer than I thought, but I got there." He reached across the table and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering a second too long against her cheek. "Only you ever could." She looked down at her hands, blinking hard, and for one unbearable second, she almost told him everything: the threats, the vial hidden in her bag, her mother's terrified face on that phone screen. The words rose in her throat and stopped there, trapped behind 6 years of love and one impossible choice. While he glanced away, distracted for just a moment by something across the restaurant, Naomi's hand moved before her heart could stop it. She poured what she believed was a harmless sedative into his glass. Minutes later, Min-jae's laughter faded mid-sentence. His hand went to the table for balance that wasn't there. And then he was on the floor, and Naomi was on her knees beside him, shaking him, whispering his name, telling herself over and over that he would simply wake up, that this was exactly what Kang had promised, that it was almost over. It wasn't a sedative at all. The doors opened. Men she didn't recognize walked in with the unhurried calm of people executing a plan they'd rehearsed 100 times. Kang himself stepped through last, kneeling beside Min-jae, pressing 2 fingers to his throat, holding them there for 3 long, silent seconds. Then he looked up at her. Did you really believe I would leave the most dangerous man in Korea alive? You said you promised. I lied. He rose slowly, straightening his jacket, studying her the way a man studies a plan finally, perfectly complete. Congratulations. You just murdered the only man who ever trusted you. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you more powerful stories like this. The truth of what she'd done crashed over Naomi all at once, and she threw herself over Min-jae's body, screaming, clawing at the hands that pulled her away, begging for a mercy that never came. They dragged her back across the floor, and the last thing she saw before the doors closed was his open, motionless hand against the tile, the same hand that, minutes earlier, had brushed the hair from her face and called her the only one who ever could. She had come full circle to the exact moment this story began. In the hours that followed, two separate stories unfolded in parallel, neither one aware of the other. Naomi's mother was released exactly as promised, delivered safely to her hotel room without so much as an apology. There was no relief in it for Naomi, only a silence heavier than anything she'd ever carried. She sat on the floor of her apartment that night, still in the same dress from dinner, holding an old photograph from university, the two of them squinting into the sun outside the library, him almost smiling, her laughing at something he'd said. She couldn't bring herself to say his name. All she could manage, over and over, in a whisper that broke apart before it finished, was the nickname that no longer felt like a joke at all. I'm sorry, Mr. Robot. Miles away, in an abandoned industrial lot on the edge of the city, Park Hyun-soo moved through the darkness with the same discipline that had kept Min-jae alive for 15 years. He'd followed the kidnapper's vehicle from a careful distance, and when they finally left, he found Min-jae exactly where they discarded him, barely breathing, dangerously cold, but alive. He carried him to a doctor his organization trusted completely, someone who operated far outside the reach of hospitals and their paperwork. For a long, terrible stretch of minutes, the heart monitor beside the table went completely silent, and Hyun-soo stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, faintly, a single beep, then another, then a slow, steady rhythm that meant Seo Min-jae was, against every reasonable expectation, still alive. He woke 3 days later with fragments of memory scattered like broken glass, the dinner, her laugh, her hand brushing his, and then nothing. Hyun-soo sat beside his bed for hours, quietly explaining what pieces he'd been able to reconstruct, watching his chairman's face carefully for any sign of what he actually remembered. While Min-jae recovered, Hyun-soo began investigating how a plan this precise could have unfolded so perfectly, how Kang's men had known exactly where to find them, exactly when to strike, exactly which restaurant, which table, which night. The answer, when it finally surfaced, landed like a second betrayal on top of the first. Lee Sung-ho, Min-jae's trusted legal advisor for nearly a decade, a man who had sat in on every major decision the organization made, had quietly been feeding information to Kang for years. It was Sung-ho who had first suggested the conference. Sung-ho who had arranged, without either of them realizing it, several of the small coincidences that had brought Min-jae and Naomi back into each other's orbit in the first place, not out of kindness, but because a reunited love story made for the perfect weapon. The betrayal, it turned out, was never only outside the walls. It had been sitting inside the room the entire time, trusted, welcomed, handed the keys. Naomi, meanwhile, existed in a fog of grief and guilt she couldn't find her way out of. She'd stopped answering calls from the conference organizers. She barely left her apartment. It wasn't until a quiet, unmarked message arrived from an unfamiliar number, a single photograph of Min-jae, alive, sitting upright in a hospital bed, that something in her chest cracked open again, equal parts hope and terror. She didn't know if she deserved to see him. She went anyway. When she finally stood in the doorway of the room where he was recovering, neither of them said anything for a long moment. She fell to her knees beside his bed, unable to look at him directly. "You should hate me," she whispered. "I remembered everything," he said quietly. Not an accusation, just a fact, laid gently on the table between them. She began to cry, the kind of crying that had been waiting days to happen. He reached out, slowly, and took her hand. "The poison wasn't the part that broke my heart," he said. She looked up at him, confused, terrified of what he might say next. "What broke my heart," he continued, "was realizing how afraid you must have been. Afraid enough to believe you had no other choice at all. That's not a betrayal, Naomi. That's what desperation does to people who love too much to lose. Rebuilding trust after something like that didn't happen in a single conversation, no matter how honest. There were nights in the weeks that followed when Naomi woke from nightmares of that dinner table, certain, for one disorienting second, that she was still watching him fall. There were moments Min-jae caught himself flinching at the sound of a wine glass being set down too hard before he could stop the reflex. Neither of them pretended those moments didn't exist. They simply sat with each other through them, which turned out to matter more than any grand gesture could have. Hyun-soo, for his part, appointed himself an entirely unofficial third wheel to their recovery, showing up with takeout at odd hours and grumbling about how much easier his job used to be when his chairman's biggest weakness was a stubborn negotiating position instead of a woman who apparently outranked him in the chairman's priorities. "You used to listen to me," Hyun-soo complained one evening, watching Min-jae check his phone for what was clearly not a business message. "I still listen to you. You used to listen to me first." Min-jae almost smiled. "Careful, that sounded dangerously close to a joke. Don't tell Naomi. She'll think she's rubbing off on the wrong person." Together, in the weeks that followed, Min-jae and Naomi exposed Lee Sung-ho's years of quiet betrayal, dismantling piece by piece the trust he'd spent a decade building on lies. Documents Sung-ho had believed permanently buried surfaced under Naomi's careful reporting instincts, and Hyun-soo's relentless digging years of payments routed through shell accounts, meetings quietly arranged to look like coincidence. A paper trail that, once exposed, told a story more damning than anyone had imagined. Sung-ho didn't run. He simply sat in Min-jae's office the day it all came apart and said only one thing before security let him out. "You would have lost eventually. I only decided when." Min-jae didn't answer him. There was nothing left to say to a man who had mistaken loyalty for a transaction his whole life. And together, Min-jae and Naomi turned their attention to the man who had orchestrated all of it from the very beginning. Min-jae found Kang exactly where he expected to, in the quiet office of an empire that was already beginning to collapse around him. Papers and loyalty both slipping through his fingers faster than he could hold on. "I told you," Kang said, almost pleased with himself even in defeat. "Love makes men weak. I proved it. I turned the woman you loved into the weapon that destroyed you." Min-jae studied him for a long moment, calm in a way that unsettled Kang far more than anger would have. "No," he said finally. "It didn't destroy me. It gave me something worth surviving for." Kang had spent 20 years believing that fear built something permanent. In the end, all it had ever built was betrayal men who served him out of terror and abandoned him the moment that terror stopped being useful. Love, the very thing he'd tried to use as a weapon, had done the opposite of what he intended. It had made Min-jae harder to break, not easier. Kang's empire fell within the month, piece by piece, the same way it had been built quietly, and then all at once. Months later, the city looked different to both of them, even though nothing about it had physically changed. Min-jae spent that season quietly restructuring his organization, cutting away the parts that had always lived in shadow, building something his father had once dreamed of, and never lived to see completed an empire that no longer needed fear to survive. Naomi published the investigation that had, without either of them planning it, started the night she first agreed to that impossible, terrible choice. It became the biggest story of her career, and the only one she almost didn't want credit for. On a quiet evening in early autumn, they returned to the Han River, the same water that had witnessed the earliest, gentlest hours of whatever this had become between them. Naomi turned to him, smiling nervously in a way that felt oddly familiar, like the first day they'd met all over again. "Mr. Robot." Before she could finish the sentence, he laughed easily, openly, without effort, the kind of laugh that no longer needed 6 years or a terrible mistake to reach the surface. She blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't even finish what I was going to say." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers the way he'd wanted to for longer than he'd ever admitted, even to himself. "You didn't need to," he said. "You finally fixed him." They walked along the river together as the sun went down over Seoul, past the same benches, the same lights reflecting on the water. Two people who had somehow found their way back to each other through betrayal, grief, and a mistake that was never truly a choice at all. Sometimes, the greatest mistakes in life are not the ones that destroy love. Sometimes they are the ones that finally reveal how far two hearts are willing to go, through fear and fire and everything in between, just to find their way back to one another. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves meaningful stories. We'll see you in our next unforgettable journey.